What did you think of the rally that your team had in the fourth quarter, particularly when it comes to Caitlin? I think she made 5 threes in that fourth quarter, more than her first 2 games combined. So just your thoughts on the resilience from her.
I thought our whole group showed resilience, in that rally. We showed the ability to make tough shots. We had some really good time and score execution moments, offensively and defensively, in those moments. We just have to have more of it.
What should have been a boring post-game media session somehow turned into one of the most awkward basketball moments of the week after Stephanie White appeared completely fed up with repeated questions about her lineup decisions. The tension in the room became impossible to ignore as reporters kept pushing for answers she clearly did not want to give, and fans online immediately sensed there was more happening beneath the surface. Are players unhappy with the current system, and did this emotional reaction accidentally reveal a bigger issue nobody saw coming?
Caitlin Clark did speak to the media after this, and Stephanie White. We finna listen to Caitlin first. Something just has to be done with this team. To me, the Indiana Fever need to fire Stephanie White before the end of the month. So today's the 15th. If they do not win a home game this next game, we seriously, I know we all make videos saying that she need to be fired, but Christie's size was not this bad. I don't give a damn that they caught back up, that they was behind by 14, 15.
The strange part was not that Indiana lost another game that came down to the final possessions, it was how everything around it started to feel like a slow unraveling that everyone could see except the people inside the building. As if the entire season had reached that point where talent alone could no longer cover the cracks that were widening every single night.
Wanted to turn the page defensively for that first game of the season. What did you like better about today?
Well, we gave up 78 points. We're going to win a lot of games.
We did.
I thought...
What more do you want?
I want more. Coaches always want more. That's the nature of beast. We gave up 11 fast break points. Transition defense, and it's hard. Sometimes turning the ball over or quick shots lead to transition opportunities, but our transition defense has to get better. I think our ball screen defense early wasn't really good. We got better in certain situations, and then we became hackers.
A double overtime loss on home court is usually the kind of result that forces silence, reflection, and accountability, especially when a franchise guard puts up a performance that would normally headline a victory anywhere else in the league. Yet what followed felt less like reflection and more like avoidance, and that is where everything started to shift.
Let's get the bad news out of the way. Stephanie White is still your coach. But damn, Caitlin Clark tried her best to single-handedly save Stephanie White's sorry A. I'm just keeping it real. Just go on. Caitlin Clark knocked down two threes. Stephanie White benched her. She benched her, and guess what? The Washington Mystics were off to the races. Off to the races. By the way, we'd love to see some pick and roll.
On one side of the floor, Caitlin Clark delivered one of those exhausting high-pressure performances that only elite guards survive, scoring at volume, stretching defenses, and dragging possessions into moments where something special had to happen just to keep the game alive, while on the other side, the scoreboard kept reminding everyone that effort without structure eventually collapses under its own weight.
And before I get into all of that, I'm just going to say this here. Fire Stephanie White ass. She's a whole bum. She's a bum of a coach. It's an absolute travesty. The Indiana Fever in this first game, and Kelsey Mitchell, I'm going to get to your ass too. 10 of 25 for 24 points. The second straight game, you haven't got a rebound, an assist. You don't even try to pass the ball. You just out there jacking up shots. I'm going to get to you. Okay, I'm going to get to you. Aaliyah Boston's injured. I'm going to cover this whole thing. But I'm going to start with Stephanie White. Caitlin Clark in the first quarter had it rolling. She hit 2 back-to-back threes. She had 3 assists. It looked like the offense was starting to pick up and click on our cylinders. We have a 12-point lead. Why do you insist on taking her out?
The final score, a 104-102 defeat after double overtime against Washington, did not just add another loss to the record, it added another layer of pressure to a situation that was already starting to feel unstable. Because games like that do not disappear quietly, they linger, they echo, and they force uncomfortable conversations that nobody wants to have out loud. What made the night even heavier was the way Indiana had arrived at that point, because this was not a single breakdown or a random cold shooting night pattern that had started repeating. itself in different forms, with lost control of its defensive identity. By the time the final buzzer sounded, the frustration was not limited to the court because fans had already seen this type of game before, where Indiana builds just enough momentum to stay alive, only to watch it slip away through the same structural problems that never seemed to change no matter who was on the floor.
Caitlin Clark, I can't blame you. I can't put the onus on you. The onus to me, majority, has to go to Stephanie White being terrible to the point where Caitlin Clark just said, F all this, I gotta go off. Desperation time, I gotta step up. And Caitlin Clark stepped up and dragged this team to overtime in a game that we probably should have put away going into the half.
And that is where the focus shifted from the game itself to what was supposed to come next, the post-game press conference. The place where coaches are expected to explain, justify, and take responsibility for what just happened. Especially after a loss that exposed so many visible issues. Instead, what unfolded felt like a slow collision between expectation and reality. When Stephanie White stepped in front of the media, the questions were predictable. At first, centered around defensive breakdowns, rotations, and the lineup decisions that had been under increasing scrutiny for weeks, but the tone in the room quickly changed as those questions kept circling back to the same theme. Why were certain words about discipline, communication, and effort phrases that are often used in post-game settings when emotions are still high and explanations need time to fully form? But as the questions continued, something in the energy of the room started to tighten, not dramatically, not explosively, but in that subtle way where it becomes clear that the conversation is no longer just about basketball tactics but about accountability. The most uncomfortable part was not what was said but what was avoided. There was no clear breakdown of why certain lineup combinations were being used in critical stretches, no detailed explanation of why defensive mismatches kept repeating themselves, and no direct engagement with the specific moments that had swung the game in Washington's favor.
The other way around. The energy has to be dictated on that end of the floor, and that's a mindset.
You just touched on a lot of it, but they had 58 points in the paint tonight, especially start overtime. They were getting there a lot. What's missing between your best defensive moments and worst?
I think a lot of things. One, intensity. I think attention to detail. It's little things. It's initial positioning. It's communication. It's reacting. It's relaxing off the ball. There are a lot of things that are outside of and great players make great plays. And the thing that Washington does is they keep moving.
Instead, the conversation kept returning to broad ideas, as if the details everyone was asking about were somehow separate from the outcome on the floor, even though the entire game had been shaped by those exact details. And then came the moment that turned a routine press conference into a viral talking point. As the questions became more pointed, focusing on rotations and in-game adjustments, the atmosphere shifted enough that it was no longer just uncomfortable. It was tense in a way that suggested the conversation had reached a limit, and at that point, the session ended abruptly with White stepping away from the podium before the media exchange had naturally concluded. In professional sports, or more accurately, the lack of a consistent one, that this is a team that can score enough to stay competitive, especially when Caitlin Clark is in rhythm, but the defensive end continues to tell a different story. One where opponents find rhythm too easily, where paint protection breaks down too often, and where momentum swings feel almost inevitable once the game reaches its critical stages. The most telling part is that even within the roster itself, frustration has started to show through in subtle but noticeable ways, particularly from players who are carrying heavy offensive loads while compensate for defensive gaps that require more than individual effort to fix.
And the glaring weakness of no length on this team was evident tonight. It was evident tonight. Let's go, folks. Good grief. It was a pretty wild game, no doubt about it. And the Iowa 22, look, the Iowa and 2024 Caitlin Clark absolutely still exist. We saw it tonight. It was fun. She tried to pull this team up.
Clark's own post-game comments reflected that reality without turning it into drama, focusing instead on the idea that when shots are not falling, the defensive intensity cannot disappear with them. A point that speaks less about blame and more about consistency and effort regardless of circumstance. That perspective matters because it highlights a divide that often emerges in struggling teams, where offensive flow becomes the emotional driver of energy. Instead of defensive responsibility, setting the tone regardless of scoring outcomes. And when that actually changed. The way lineups function under pressure, instead, the public messaging has leaned heavily on general concepts. Which is not unusual in professional sports but becomes more noticeable when the same problems continue to appear in different matchups against different opponents. That is why the reaction to the press conference was so immediate. Because it did not exist in isolation. It connected directly to a growing sense among fans that the issues on the floor are not being addressed in a way that produces visible change, and when that perception, every loss starts to feel heavier than the last, not because of the scoreboard alone, but because of the feeling that the same story is being written over and over again with slightly different endings.
Did not need to take her out in that first quarter. She was playing well. They had a time. They called a timeout. She was able to catch her second win. She's okay. Let her finish playing in the first quarter. You don't know what will happen, Stephanie White. We could have been up 23, 24 points by the end of the first quarter if you would have left Caitlin Clark in the way the game was going. You just find ways to throw off her rhythm. You got Aaliyah Boston at the top of the damn key the whole time, which I think when Aaliyah Boston went out, that's part of the reason Caitlin Clark was able to get off, because she had her out of the way at the top of the key. Okay, Stephanie White takes out Caitlin Clark in the first quarter when she absolutely is cooking, has it rolling. And then by the time you put her back in, we go from having a 10, 12 point lead to a 1 point lead. Why?
The reality is that Indiana is still early enough in its season that nothing is mathematically decided. But emotionally, seasons are often judged long before the standings confirm anything, especially when expectations are elevated and